by discussing just how you do the adding up of individual supply into an industry supply, which is going to be quite mechanical, except for the fact that entry of new firms can create kinks and discontinuities in the aggregate supply, and we'll talk about how that can be smoothed out by the introduction of uncertainty. We'll then talk about sort of the long run and free entry as well as barriers to entry. And in particular, we'll emphasize how some firms are able to earn a profit, gain a rent, by being more efficient than other firms are. And we'll contrast sort of the textbook analysis of how in the long run the entry of new firms eliminates profits, and except when there are barriers in entry, to a perspective that I'm going to emphasize, which is going to be the importance of differences between different producers, that some are more efficient than others, and how that generates rents, because some people have basically greater talents than other people do. And that only for a very narrowly construed type of an industry is it going to be very easy to enter and do just as well as someone who's already in the industry. And we'll try to quantify that by using some empirical regularities, namely Zipf's law, which is a very elegant regularity about the distribution of firms' abilities. And this will set the stage for a lot of the things we're going to study later in the course. So to derive an industry supply from an individual firm supply is pretty simple. Basically, all you do is you add up all of the supply curves horizontally. And in some sense, this is what you could have done on your problem set. That was one option. You could have taken all the marginal cost curves and added them up horizontally to get the total cost curve. That's one way to do cost minimization when you have different technologies. And that is the industry supply, S bar of P, is just the sum of the individual firm supplies. And this is particularly simple when all firms enter the market at a price of 0. That is, the minimum price at which all firms are willing to produce is 0. But in that case, the industry supply is just the sum of the inverse of the marginal cost curves. And we can then get sort of a industry marginal cost curve, which is the inverse of the industry supply curve. So here's an example of that. If here are a bunch of firm supply curves, these all come out of Cobb Douglas, we can just add them up horizontally and get this industry supply curve. Yeah?
Is there any significance to the individual inverse marginal cost or inverse supply? Like, why?
That'll tell you what an individual firm is going to produce. And that'll help you derive the profits that an individual firm earns, which we'll do in a couple of minutes.
Is that related to like when we did the inverse of the cost function?
Exactly. Yeah. So we had the marginal cost function. We did the inverse of that. We got the supply function. Then we add those up to get the industry supply. Yeah. Okay. So the nice thing, the reason that this picture was so nice and simple, right, is that all the firms entered the market at a price of 0. That is, they started producing something even when the price was 0. But many firms, of course, have fixed costs, as we've been emphasizing for the last 2 lectures, and would not enter at a price of 0. They might require a higher price. And if they, when the price gets up to the price where they're willing to enter at a quantity of 0, that is, that as, if the price is 5, they'll produce 0 units. If the price is 5.1, they'll produce, some very small number of units and then gradually increase from there. Then all that this does is create kinks. So to give an example of that, imagine here are some firm supply functions. This firm enters at 0. This firm enters at a small amount, but enters continuously. This firm enters at a high price, but again enters continuously. Well, then you get an industry supply function which adds these up, which is continuous, but it has these kinks at the point at which different firms enter. However, if firms enter at a positive quantity, then there are discontinuities. So imagine that, here's one firm that enters at this price and it enters at a positive quantity. This firm enters at this price, again enters at a positive quantity. This firm enters at this price, enters at a very large quantity. Then you get this industry supply function, which is basically has a bunch of discontinuities in it. Because when one of these firms enters, the industry supply increases by a discontinuous amount. Okay, so this can be annoying because it makes it so that we can't use calculus. It also is annoying because imagine that you had a demand curve that cut through this industry supply function at this point, right? Well, the industry would never supply something in between here. So it's not really clear that you could have an equilibrium in that case. Or what would happen. So in practice, this problem is not nearly as bad as it appears. One of the most important reasons is that sort of uncertainty about the points at which the firm enters can smooth things out. So firms may have entry points, but we usually don't know for certain at exactly what price they would enter the market, right? So we might think that the firm at some point is going to enter, but they might enter at a price of 5, they might enter at a price of 6, they might enter somewhere in between. And when this is the case, we can just think of the relevant quantity not being the supply, but the average supply to the market. And once we do that, everything sort of gets blurred out, and there's no longer these discontinuities. The average supply is much more continuous than is the supply. And that's exactly what happened in that Athey and Nikiforov data that we looked at, when you had all these different, you were competing with all these different people who were offering different prices to get a spot on the ranking on the Google page. If you were uncertain about what their bids were going to be because you submitted a price and over the course of the 2 weeks people could be bidding all sorts of different things, that made you have this much smoother cost of bidding. The second thing is that these discontinuities have to be small if any given firm is a small part of the market, right? So in the real world, it is the case that there are some firms which really are quite large and can create a large discontinuity. But to the extent that this is the case, it's not really appropriate to use the sort of competitive price-taking model that we've been using. So an example of that is that, imagine we were in this case where there was this one firm that created this big discontinuity. And imagine that demand went through this gap. Then what do you think that the firm would do if it knew that demand was cutting through here and that it was making this big difference in causing there not to be an equilibrium in the market? What do you think that firm would do?
I think it would have to lower its prices so that they could hit the demand function, right? Because they'd sell more.
Well, or, I mean...
Like a shift their supply curve left, right? Or down.
Yeah, so they would lower their quantity, right?
Oh, they lower their quantity.
Right? If they lower their quantity, that raises the price. And then the price is high enough so that they're willing to supply this smaller quantity, and they earn more profits on it, right? So the point is that this actually doesn't really cause a problem once we take into account the fact that if a firm is so big that it has this big impact on whether there's a market equilibrium or not, it'll have an incentive to reduce its quantity, like a monopolist, as we'll study in a few lectures, to make sure that the market clears. So a lot of the times when you get something weird, like there's no equilibrium because it's cutting through, what it's indicating to you is not that you don't know what the heck's going on, but rather that you've got the wrong model. And that once you take into account the fact that the firm can have this big impact, you'll realize that they'll want to reduce their quantity in order to try to raise the price. So basically, to the extent that we're going to assume price taking, it's also pretty reasonable to assume away these types of big discontinuities, because anytime those arise, the firms aren't going to have an incentive to act as price takers. And we'll return to this actually both in a few minutes and on the lecture on Thursday. Okay, so in all of these pictures, the firms were earning some positive profits or rents. So a natural question is what determines the size of these? From the earlier analysis we did, it's the area to the left of the supply curve, right? The more the firm is producing, the more rent it earns, and the wider range of prices at which it would be willing to produce, the more rent it earns, right? Because if it's willing to produce at a wide range of prices, then its supply curve is going to be in, and there's going to be more area between it and the y-axis, right? And that means that the more efficient is the firm for the average unit that it produces relative to the marginal unit, the more profits the firm will earn. So if the firm can produce the average unit very cheaply, but the marginal unit not so cheaply, and that's equal to the price, then the firm is going to earn a lot of profits, right? But of course, the price in the market is determined not just by the firm, but by the set of all the firms in the industry, by the industry supply function, right? And so the key is going to be how efficient are you relative to everybody else's marginal cost. If on average you can produce things efficiently compared to the marginal cost of everybody at the margin, which determines the price, you're going to be earning a lot of profits. So the key is how much better are you than other people, effectively, right? And so this means that there are basically two sources of rents under competition. One is that basically you are able to produce inframarginal units much more efficiently than your marginal unit, and second, that you're better than other people are, right? And so one thing this indicates, right, is that you're always going to produce where your marginal cost is equal to the price. And you're going to earn a lot of profits if your average cost is much lower than that. So what that says is that people who are earning a lot of profits are also people whose marginal cost is much, much higher than their average cost. That is, that effectively they're operating at a point where they're much less productive than they are on average. So this is basically the reason why all things that are doing really well are also really stressed out. So if you think about it, a doctor who is much better than other doctors is going to be in incredibly high demand. Everyone's going to want him to be helping them out, and he's going to be operating at the point where his marginal cost has gotten all the way down to where it's equal to the price, right? So his marginal productivity is way lower than his average productivity is. Whereas people who aren't so good, right, their marginal productivity is already pretty close on average to the level of the market, therefore they earn very little profits. So it shouldn't be at all surprising, in fact it comes directly out of the theory, that the most productive people are also going to be the people who are going to be most stressed out. Because it necessarily has to be the case that they be driven to the point where their marginal productivity is equal to the marginal productivity of everybody else, right? And this is the reason why the best restaurants are constantly packed, and why talented people are constantly turning down offers to do lots of things, why they're in very high demand and have to, turn away so many people who are interested in them. So the notion that accomplished people are stressed is just an implication of competitive theory. Okay, so one natural question is, if there's someone who's earning a lot of profits, but their average cost is way